Today we're going to talk a little bit about Josiah Royce because I want you to have some idea of what idealists wrote like and sounded like in the 19th century before we get to G.E. Moore's refutation of idealism and the beginning of analytic philosophy. I'm going to show you a timeline a little bit later, but this is a picture of Josiah Royce. One of the most interesting descriptions of Royce that I have seen uses this phrase. Josiah Royce writes, I have seen it claimed, in bloated and bloviating prose. Now, I don't know how much you liked reading Josiah Royce's writings, but I think you can see some truth in that description. In any case, that's a picture of Josiah Royce. And the essay you read, Reality and Idealism, is really interesting. It was published in 1892, but it was given much earlier. The lectures that the Spirit of Modern Philosophy collects are interesting because they're actually Sunday school lessons given at church by Royce, which is somewhat interesting. I can't imagine. I don't know how many of you went to church or grew up in church, but listening to Josiah Royce's philosophy lectures doesn't sound like what happened in any church I've ever heard of. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the structure of the piece or the particular arguments in it. I just want to call your attention to some instructive quotes from it. So here's a first one. For reasons that you will see later, I object indeed to the unhappy word unknowable. In the world of experience, as in the world of abstracter problems, there are infinitely numerous things unknown to us, but there is no rational question that could not somehow be answered by a sufficiently wise person. There are things relatively unknowable for us, not things absolutely so. There are numberless experiences that I shall have in my individual capacity, and there are numberless problems that I shall never solve, but the only absolute insoluble mysteries, as I shall hereafter point out to you, would be the questions that it is essentially absurd to ask. Now, this quote here indicates the kind of metaphysical anti-realism that is distinctive of the idealism in question. And notice what it focuses on. It focuses on the question of knowability. Are there unknowable truths? If there are unknowable truths, then the view that Royce and other idealists are defending is false. So he talks about the possibility of unknowable truths and says, no, there cannot be absolute insoluble mysteries. The questions of such a thing would be essentially absurd to ask. Here, I think it is worth noting that there's Here, I think it's worth noting that there's a paradox for such a view called the knowability paradox. I'm not going to spend any time talking about this. I've written a book on the subject. In any case, the knowability paradox generates a problem for the view that there are unknowable truths. It derives from the work of Fred Fitch in the 1950s. It's sometimes called the Fitch paradox. Fred Fitch taught logic at Yale, and he published a paper in which he gave the knowability paradox. And he argued that if there are unknown truths, there have to be unknowable truths. So The converse of that is that if everything is knowable, then everything is in fact known, and he thought that was an absurd view. He called it silly verificationism. And that seems like a title that is apt for such a view. If anything is clear, it's that there are things that are unknown. In any case, the paradox is an interesting challenge to this view if it holds up. The argument goes like this. Suppose there is an unknown truth. Then we've got a claim P that's true, and it's not known that P. I won't go through all of the details, but if this is a truth and it itself is knowable, if all truths are knowable, then this one can be known. So let the diamond be, it is possible that it's known that P. If it's possible that it's known that P, then using the standard device of possible worlds, there is some world in which the bracketed claim is true. Then go to that world. So let's go to a world where this claim is true. What else is true in this world? Well, the claim of the knowability paradox is that knowledge of a conjunction distributes. So, if you know that a conjunction is true, you know the first conjunct, and you know the second conjunct. Furthermore, knowledge is factive. Whatever you know has to be true. You can't know falsehoods. So you can't know that 2 plus 2 equals 5 because it doesn't. You perhaps can think you know. I don't think I've ever met anybody who thought that 2 plus 2 is 5 or thought that they knew that 2 plus 2 is 5. But there are other falsehoods that people take themselves to know. Apparently some people used to think, and maybe some people now think, that the world is flat. And they may think that they know that the world is flat. My grandmother on my mother's side thought we never landed on the moon, and she thought she could prove it, so she took herself to know that we never landed on the moon. She thought the pictures were taken in the deserts in Arizona, for example. In any case, you can think you know something and it be false, but you can't actually know it because you can't know what's not the case. If you know something to be true, it has to be the case. So take this second claim. If you know that you don't know that P, then the object of your knowledge has to be true. So it follows from this line that you don't know that P. And now you have a contradiction. Now, of course, this is only in some possible world. Remember, we started up here with a claim that was possibly true. So what we end up with is the result that a contradiction might be true. We haven't yet got an actual contradiction, but there's a fairly easy, simple proof from the possibility of a contradiction to an actual contradiction. I won't go through that. If you're interested or have taken the intermediate logic class, this is one of the exercises that you did for that class, or would do for that class if you take it. So in any case, the starting point of Royce's idealism asserts the knowability of all truth, and it confronts a paradox immediately. That's one interesting fact about idealism. Idealism is a form of anti-realism. The deepest and most problematic argument against idealism comes from the knowability paradox. So if you recall, I said, I think when we were talking about the syllabus, that the divide between realists and anti-realists focuses on things like Descartes' evil demon world. In Descartes' evil demon world, the demon deceives you about everything he possibly can. That means lack of knowledge is rampant in evil demon worlds. So idealists take on the burden of having to show that there's something corrupt or misleading or indefensible or essentially absurd about thinking about possible skeptical scenarios like Descartes' evil demon world. Notice, as Royce describes it, there'd have to be something essentially absurd about such evil demon worlds. That's a general characteristic of the kinds of idealisms that Moore is going to argue against. Some of the other quotes give you a better understanding of the kind of personality and attitude we find in Royce. So look at the second quote. This truth is, I assure you, simply a product of dry logic. When I try to tell you about it in detail, I shall weary you by my wholly unmystical analysis of commonplaces. Idealism is often viewed as a metaphysical view that waxes mystical by the time you get to the end of it, especially the absolute part of absolute idealism. It starts looking like mystical ramblings. Maybe somebody's been smoking peyote or something like that. It looks just like the farthest thing from common sense, ordinary thinking about things. And yet, Royce insists that this is going to be really boring. The arguments on behalf of the view are such trivialities and truisms and banalities that you're just going to be bored to tears. Now, you can speak for yourself about whether you found reading Royce boring, but in any case, that's what he claims. It's interesting when we get to Moore, and Moore is the champion of common sense philosophy. It's instructive that the people he's arguing against appeal to the same thing, at least at times. The truth is, according to Royce, simply a product of dry logic. We'll see that it's not as simple as he says it is, but in any case, that's his attitude. So that's the view, that's the attitude. Look at the third quote. I must remind you that idealism has two aspects. It is, for the first, a kind of analysis of the world. Note that use of the word analysis. We'll come back to it. An analysis which so far has no absolute character about it, but which undertakes in a fashion that might be acceptable to any skeptic to examine what you mean by all the things, whatever they are, that you believe in or experience. The idealistic analysis consists merely in a pointing out by various devices that the world of your knowledge, whatever it contains, is through and through such stuff as ideas are made of, that you never in your life believed in anything definable but ideas, that, as Berkeley put it, this whole choir of heaven and furniture of earth is nothing for any of us but a system of ideas which govern our belief and conduct. So that's a clear expression of idealism. Everything is through and through such stuff as ideas are made of. That's the first aspect. The other aspect of idealism is one which gives our notion of the absolute self, which gives us our notion of the absolute self. So notice the first part is the kind of idealism that we get from Berkeley. But absolute idealism has both the idealistic aspect and the absolute aspect. So the other aspect of idealism is the one which gives us our notion of the absolute self. To it, the first is only preparatory. The second aspect is the one which, from Kant until the present time, has formed the deeper problem of thought. Notice here, Royce thinks the defense of idealism that you get from Berkeley is not really troubling at all. That's the stuff that's just a product of the dry logic. The absolute part is the deeper problem. Whenever the world has become more conscious of its significance, the work of human philosophy will be not merely ended, heaven forbid an end, but for the first time fairly begun. For then, in critically estimating our passions, we shall have some truer sense of whose passions they are. So there are two aspects. There's the idealism aspect, and then there's the absolute aspect. And the more significant part for Royce is the second part. In this way, I suggest to you the proof which a rigid analysis of the logic of our most commonplace thought would give for the doctrine that in the world there is but one self, and that it is his world which we all alike are truly meaning, whether we talk of another, or of Cromwell's character, or of the fixed stars, or of the far-off suns of the future. The relation of my thought to its object has, I insist, this curious character, that unless the thought and its object are parts of one larger thought, I can't even be meaning that object yonder, can't even be in error about it, can't even doubt its existence. So you can see how the absolute monism is supposed to arise. We're going to give an analysis of our thought, and to make sense of that, we're going to have to posit that all of our thinking, all of our being, everything is part of one larger system that is monadic in character, absolute in character, and which is, in some sense, mental. So you get a grand thing itself, which contains every other thing that we are part of, everything is part of it. That's the absolute monism part of absolute idealism. That sounds quite mystical, and yet Royce is convinced it's nothing but a matter of dry logic that leads to this conclusion. That's the sense I want you to take away from the kind of defenses of idealism that you get in the 19th century. It's supposed to be common sense. It's supposed to be defensible by clearly, easy, and simple arguments. And it leads you to this metaphysical conclusion that to our ears may sound mystical. But you can see why this would sound good. It would resonate with people having religious sensibilities in a Sunday school class. Because as soon as you start talking about this larger all-inclusive thing, they will think you're talking about God. And Royce takes himself to be doing exactly that. If he is doing that, it's not a version of classical theism, of course. It's closer to a version of pantheism than anything else. Everything is a part of God, and God is the all-inclusive thing that includes everything else. Pantheism is not always an idealistic view, however. Pantheism in general is the view that just identifies all of reality with God. But you can get absolute idealism to be a version of this. That's the background for the beginning part of the course, the absolute idealism of the 19th century, and especially the British absolute idealism of F.H. Bradley. Here's a timeline that I'm going to keep coming back to about the major events in the first half of the history of analytic philosophy, which is basically from the origins in a rejection of absolute idealism to the end of the First World War, when logical positivism comes on the scene. So the major dates, the key points that we will be focusing on, predate G.E. Moore, even though the most important date, as I see the history here, is G.E. Moore's initial writings, starting with the refutation of idealism. After we get G.E. Moore, we will turn to Russell, and to understand Russell, you have to step back to Frege. So the first date on our timeline is 1879. Frege was a mathematician taught at Jena in Germany. Let me see if I can write that legibly. In a mathematics department, but he was interested in the foundations of mathematics. And his first work is called the Begriffsschrift, which was published in 1879. So we can take that as the starting point for our timeline. This period in the history of philosophy ends in 1939, which is well after the end of the First World War. But I include it because that's when we're going to read Moore's Proof of an External World, which was a lecture that he gave on the occasion of his retirement at Cambridge. And it summarizes much of his early work in defense of common sense philosophy and the like, even though it was published quite late. So those are the endpoints. As you can see, however, the major endpoint is by 1925, a little bit after the end of World War II. So we get in 1925 More's Defense of Common Sense, which is again a sort of compilation summary of the kinds of things More had been arguing for since the 1890s. Notice the first More piece occurs in 1903. So prior to that, we'll have the Fregean background in the last quarter of a century of the 19th century. And then we get More's The Refutation of Idealism in 1903 being published, finally. It is a response to Bradley's 1893 Appearance in Reality, so I include that on the timeline as well. So basically, we can say analytic philosophy has its origins in the last quarter of the 19th century and begins centrally with this paper, The Refutation of Idealism. It's also the year that More published his famous Principia Ethica, his work in ethics. The history of analytic philosophy is only in an ancillary way about ethics. It is primarily about metaphysics and epistemology, philosophy of language, and philosophy of mind. In my introductory courses in philosophy, I have a handout or a slide where I talk about the heart and soul of philosophy. And those are interesting metaphors. I can't remember which one I do, but the heart of philosophy is ethics, and the soul of philosophy is M&E. So the heart of philosophy is where it gets its start. It gets its start from concerns about the good life. And so you get all the normative stuff of ethics and social and political and that sort of thing, even some aesthetics coming out of the heart of philosophy. You start doing philosophy, thinking about philosophy from the standpoint of reflecting on your life, the life of people in general, communal life, and what makes for a good life, what makes for a flourishing, fulfilling kind of existence. And very quickly, when you do that, what happens is you end up doing what happened in ancient Greece. You end up thinking about metaphysics and epistemology. That's the soul of philosophy. And all of a sudden, you find yourself having to deal with questions about what we can know, what the universe is like, what reality is like on the whole. And in any case, that's the sort of thing that forms the core of analytic philosophy. So I put More's Principia on the timeline because he's so famous for that book. But we aren't going to be talking about ethics very much. You are free, of course, to explore ethical topics in your work for the course. So if you're really interested in More's ethics, that would be a fine paper topic for the first part of the course. In any case, both of those occur in 1903. Then, after we look a little bit at More, we'll look at this paper first, and then we'll jump ahead historically and look at two other of More's papers to get a good sense of what he's about. But the primary influence of More's early work, The Refutation of Idealism, is in the life of Russell. And you can see what happens here. More convinces Russell to give up idealism. He does. And then what we get is Russell's work in philosophy as the product of this conversion. So in 1905, probably the most famous paper in the history of analytic philosophy and in the 20th century is Russell's On Denoting. He then publishes Principia Mathematica in 1910, and then we get some of his metaphysics and epistemology in these readings. Knowledge by Acquaintance and Knowledge by Description. That's a paper. It forms a part of his little intro book, The Problems of Philosophy, on the notion of cause, is illustrative of the most beautiful way to write an intro paper, an introductory section to a paper. Moore published Ethics in 1912 as well, so that's a follow-up to his Principia Ethica book. And then we have Frege turning philosophical in the late parts of his life at the end of World War I, when he publishes Thought, which gives his most metaphysical account of his work in the Foundations of Method. After Moore and Russell, the next important figure is going to be Wittgenstein, who shows up, as we will see, in Cambridge in 1911, ends up fighting in World War II and not publishing the work that he's most famous for early on, the Tractatus, until 1922. He wrote it in a prisoner of war camp in World War I, but it was published first in German and then the English translation in 1922. Wittgenstein's dissertation director was Ramsay, and Ramsay published a rather devastating review of the Tractatus the year after it appeared, and the criticisms he had of the Tractatus ended up being what led Wittgenstein to come back to Cambridge after going to Austria and teaching school for most of the 1920s. He came back, and though he never said it, the kinds of issues that he began talking about and moved him toward the later period of Wittgensteinian thought were precisely the criticisms that Ramsay raised in the 1923 review. By the time we get into the 1920s, though, Wittgenstein thought this book solved all the problems of philosophy, but he thought that by as early as 1917 or 1918. The book wasn't published until later, but Wittgenstein was done with philosophy, so he left and went back to Austria to teach school. So the 1920s are not dominated by Wittgenstein's thought in the sense of him playing a key figurehead role by being at Cambridge or anything like that. Instead, what happened was the rise of logical positivism. So there was first the Vienna Circle, and then in 1927 in Berlin, a similar society began. And we'll talk more about that, but the 1920s are the beginnings of logical positivism in the Vienna Circle and similar societies founded in other places. In any case, it's easy to see 1921 and 22 as a key cutoff date for the first parts of the history of analytic philosophy. So we will treat 1879 to 1922 as the period when the work of Frege, Moore, Russell, and early Wittgenstein dominate the history of analytic philosophy.